Most people will tell you either tough it out in a bad first IT job because you need the experience, or leave immediately because life's too short for a toxic workplace. Both answers are too simple. The real question isn't whether your job is hard, it's whether you're learning anything useful while you're there. So if you're early in your IT career, you're probably facing a version of this right now. Your first job is stressful. Maybe you're underpaid. Management might be chaotic. The work feels overwhelming, but you also know you need experience, and leaving after a few months looks terrible on a resume. So you're stuck trying to figure out whether you should stay and tough it out, or whether you're wasting time in a situation that's actually hurting your career. The problem with most advice about this is that it treats all difficulty the same. It's not. Most hard jobs teach you valuable skills despite being miserable. Some comfortable jobs teach you nothing despite keeping you busy. And that difference actually matters because your career depends on what you learn early, not how long you can endure. You've probably heard, two completely, contradictory pieces of advice. The first is that you need to pay your dues. Everyone's first job is difficult. Stay at least a year, maybe two. Leaving early makes you look like someone who quits when things get challenging. The second is that no job is worth sacrificing your mental health. If you're miserable, leave. There are better opportunities out there. Both of these contain some truth, but both are also incomplete. Staying in a generally bad environment has real costs. You can develop learned helplessness. You can pick up bad habits from dysfunctional teams. You can miss other opportunities while you're waiting for things to improve. And you can burn out before your career really starts. But leaving after 3 months because the work is hard also has costs. You lose the opportunity to develop skills you would have gained by pushing through difficult problems. And you make it harder to explain your career trajectory to future employers. The right decision depends on what you're actually gaining and what you're actually giving up. So what matters here? The value of a first IT job isn't primarily about the title, the company name, or even the pay. What matters is whether you're developing skills that transfer to other environments, gaining real responsibilities, and working around people who can teach you how to think about technical problems. Your first job is an investment in capabilities you'll use for years. The return comes from what you learn to do, not from how much you suffer or how long you stay. That means you need to evaluate your situation based on specific factors, not vague feelings about whether you like your job. So when it comes to productive discomfort versus destructive dysfunction, not all difficulty serves the same purpose. You need to distinguish between discomfort that builds skill and discomfort that just wastes time. Productive discomfort comes from learning new technologies, working on unfamiliar problems, taking on responsibilities you haven't handled before. You feel overwhelmed because you're stretching. You're learning faster than you're comfortable with. That's normal and valuable. Maybe you're troubleshooting systems where you don't know all the components yet. Maybe you're responsible for a task where you have to figure things out as you go. This kind of difficulty teaches you how to learn, how to work through uncertainty, how to solve problems without perfect information. Destructive dysfunction is different. It comes from arbitrary decisions, unclear expectations, blame instead of feedback, being set up to fail. You're stressed because no one knows what they're doing. Rules change consistently. You're being held responsible for things you have no control over. Maybe you're assigned projects with no requirements and then criticized for not reading minds. Maybe every mistake gets treated as a character flaw rather than a learning opportunity. Maybe your work gets ignored or discarded because nobody actually planned what they needed. The first kind of difficulty brings judgment. The second kind just makes you better at tolerating specific broken environment. And that skill doesn't transfer. And what are you actually learning here? Here's the central question you really need to answer now is, are you gaining skills that will serve you in other environments, or are you just accumulating time? Ask yourself what you've learned in the past 3 months. Be specific. Can you work on technologies or tools you couldn't use before? Can you troubleshoot problems you wouldn't have known how to approach earlier? Have you gained exposure to production systems, security considerations, architectural decisions you wouldn't have seen otherwise? Some of the most valuable learning in early career IT comes from seeing how systems actually work in production, how failures happen, how teams communicate during incidents, how technical decisions create long-term consequences. If you're getting that kind of exposure, even in a chaotic environment, you're learning things that matter. On the other hand, if you're doing the same narrow task, repeatedly with no increasing complexity, you're not developing. It doesn't matter how hard you're working. If you could do the same work 6 months ago that you can do now, you're stagnating. A good first job, even if it's difficult, gives you increasing responsibility over time. You move from watching to doing, from simple tasks to complex ones, from supervised work to independent decisions. If you started by following runbooks and now you're writing them, that's progress. If you started by fixing tickets and now you're deciding to prioritize them and how to do that, that's big, right? Responsibility growth tells you two things. First, you're learning fast enough that people trust you with more complex work. Second, you're building a track record of handling increasing scope, which is what future employers look for. If your responsibilities really haven't changed in 6 months and there's no indication they will, you need to start thinking maybe about leaving. It doesn't matter how busy you are. If you're doing the same things with no expanding scope, you're not really building a career. So I want to flip the switch more on like a mentorship question, to bring up here. So bad management is common, right? Especially in small IT organizations. What matters more than whether management is competent is whether you have access to people who know what they're doing and are willing to help you learn. A chaotic environment with skilled engineers who answer questions, explain their thinking, review work, can teach you more than the well-organized environment with nobody mentoring you. You're trying to learn how to think about technical problems, how to make decisions under uncertainty, how to evaluate trade-offs. You learn those things from people, not from processes. If you're surrounded by people who just don't know what they're doing or actively withhold information, you're not paying a high opportunity cost for staying, really. You'll spend years unlearning bad habits and filling gaps you could have avoided. Ask yourself whether anyone in your environment is genuinely trying to help you develop, not just being nice, but actually investing time in teaching you. If you have that, it compensates for a lot of other problems. If you don't, that's a serious reason to consider leaving, maybe. So what about staying? When does that become the risk here? Many career professionals assume that staying is always safer than leaving. It's not most of the time. Staying in a job, whether you stopped learning 6 months ago, means you're trading time for nothing. Every month you stay is a month you could have spent developing skills somewhere else. When you finally leave, you'll have 2 years of experience, but only 6 months of actual learning. That gap shows up in interviews. Staying in an environment that undermines your confidence or teaches you bad habits means you're moving backwards. And staying until you burn out means you lose your ability to learn effectively, even when you do find a better opportunity. The goal isn't to accumulate suffering, right? The goal is to develop capabilities. If staying is preventing that, leaving becomes the more responsible choice. So how do you evaluate your situation with all this? Here's a practical framework. First, create a simple monthly self-assessment. Write down what new technical skills you learned, what new responsibilities you've gained, what problems you can now handle that you couldn't before. If you see consistent progress, the job is probably still useful regardless of how it feels. If you can't identify meaningful progress for 2 or 3 months in a row, that's a signal. Second, identify whether you have access to people who can teach you. If you do and you're still learning from them, you can tolerate more dysfunction in other areas. If you don't, start looking. And third, set a realistic time frame, based on what you're learning. If you're still gaining valuable skills every month, you can probably stay longer. If you stopped learning 3 months ago and nothing has changed, start preparing to move even if you haven't hit a year yet. The right time frame isn't about hitting an arbitrary number. It's about maximizing what you learned while minimizing opportunity cost. So if you do decide to leave, you need to be able to explain the decision in a way that makes sense to experienced professionals. Before you quit, have a clear story about what you learned and why you're leaving. If you can explain that you gained specific technical skills, worked on particular types of problems, and are now looking for opportunities to expand into other similar areas, that story makes sense. If your only reason is that the job was hard or you didn't like the culture, reconsider whether you're making the decision for the right reasons. Start building your next opportunity while you're still employed. Update your skills, work on projects that demonstrate competence. Begin networking. Leaving is easier when you're moving towards something specific rather than just away from something difficult. So as a final thought here, stop asking whether your job is hard. Start asking whether you're learning useful skills, gaining real responsibilities, and working for people who care about your development. Both staying too long and leaving too quickly can harm your career. The right decision depends on what you're gaining and what you're giving up. Your first IT job doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to teach you something worth knowing. If it's doing that, stay. It should be teaching you something, right? That makes more sense overall. But if it is doing that, go ahead and stay. If it's not, there's no realistic prospect that will change. Start preparing for your next move. You're not trying to optimize for comfort or endurance. You're trying to optimize for career development. And that requires thinking clearly about what you're actually getting in return for your time. Subscribe for more of this every week, and I'll see you in the next one.